So thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. I'm very happy for this joint session of the two cycle of seminars, the SPARC, that is here at ICS, and a monthly seminar on social movements and political action that is taking place at ISCTE, here close. And it is a monthly seminar that was created in 2014, so it's going now, and it has now almost 100 sessions. And we are really happy today to have this joint session. We have already here among our speakers, Professor Zakaria Mafili, that was already hosted in this seminar. So thank you, welcome again. And also welcome to all the other participants today. Of course, the editor of the book that we are discussing today, Popular Protest, Political Opportunities and Change in Africa, Professor Edalina Rodrigues Sanches. And I also welcome Maria Angeles. Thank you for joining us today. And Oscar Mateus, thank you too. And I leave the floor to my colleague Tiago that will introduce very quickly today's speakers. And after we open the discussion without wasting more time. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us.
One at a time, and I'll just... Maybe it's no, all of them. Okay, so very quickly, very quickly, we'll have 4 speakers today, and welcome everyone. Edalina, who's right here, is a research fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences here at University of Lisbon, and she works on democratization, representation, and political behavior in Africa. Besides the book that she is the editor and is presenting today, she also published Party Systems and Young Democracies with Routledge, and she has currently a ICT funded project exploring parliamentary activity and party citizenship party citizens linkages in Africa. Then we have also Zakaria Mafili, I said it right, who teaches at is a chair of international affairs at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at CUNY, New York, and he co-founded the program on African social research and wrote the book Rebel Rulers, Insurgent Governance and Civilian Life During War. Then we also have Oscar Mateus, who is a professor of international relations at the Blanquerna School of Communication and International Relations, Ramon Llull University, and not only teaches there, as he also leads the Global Codes Research Group that focus on conflict analysis and post-conflict peace-building processes. And then last but not least, Maria Angeles Alaminos Hervas, currently a professor in the Department of International Studies at Loyola Andalusia University, and who works on armed conflict, peace building, and EU-Africa relations, and has conducted fieldwork in several African countries. So I welcome all the speakers, and everyone will have a session in which Edalina will talk first, and then we'll have our guests as well. So welcome everyone. Edalina, the floor is yours. We said 15 minutes, right? Absolutely. And then after we open the floor for discussion.
Well, I again, everyone, thank you. Let me thank Oscar, Zach, and Maria once again for being here today to discuss this book. I mean, it has been more than a year now when the book has been published, but we haven't had the chance to discuss it like with colleagues here at Lisbon. And Guya and Tiago, they said, well, why don't you present it within our seminar? And we felt, well, let's do it. It's simple. And of course, it became even simpler when the 3 of you accepted to participate in this discussion. And I know that some of you are going to traveling and some very exciting news upcoming, exciting personal news as well. So thank you for finding time for this book. So let me just tell you briefly the story of this book. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll try to be brief. I also want to thank the authors that were able to join this presentation. I can see Ana Lucia Sá and François Paulet. Ana Lucia co-wrote a paper on the chapter on Angola, and François Paulet, I start talking French. It's automatic, so I have to do. François Paulet prepared a paper on Congo. So thank you both. Two excellent presentations. Thank you for being there. And of course, if there are tough questions, you will be answering the tough questions. I'll only stay with the fun part. So let me just start presenting the book. I'll be very brief because I think the point here is actually to hear some of the thoughts that you might have on this. And I'll start first by introducing this idea. So let me first start telling you how this happened. So first, we were going through the pandemic, and I felt, why not write a book on popular protest, political opportunities, and change in Africa? This has been a long desire to write about this, and I felt that we had sufficient and very good quality books already in the field, and a lot of people actually working on protest or social movement activity in Africa. And I felt like I wanted to be part of that discussion, even though it's not my area of specialty and not my area now that I'm working on other topics. I have prepared to you a very, very short presentation on the book. I'll start with introducing the why, because this book focuses on the third wave of protests. So I'll briefly introduce you to this concept, and then I'll try to present the book's main arguments, and then I'll try to summarize the findings from 11 case studies. But it's pretty impossible to do that. But anyway, of course, I'll miss some relevant aspects. But some of the authors are here and can perhaps complement on the things that I'll have to share. So in terms of the waves of protest, the sea always have as little waves every day, but we distinguish a big wave when finally we have a significant number of events, of sustained events that spread across geographies within a confined period of time. And based on this idea, several authors, including the Carvalho Manfili, they have written and they have tried to delimit these different waves of protests in Africa. So a first wave happened during the process of creating revolutions in Africa for independence and liberation. So this led to a first period of transformation within African political settings. And that brought independence to most countries during this period, but a few exceptions after the 70s, such as in the Portuguese case. And then followed the second wave of protests, which happened particularly after the first oil shock and all the implementation of adjustable programs in Africa and the economic crisis that I'm sorry, you can't see this. And the economic crisis that hit the continent during that period, and all that was predicted to be implemented during this period with the structural adjustment plans. So this was a very particular moment with the first types of, bread and butter type of protests in Africa. And this pretty much led to the political opening of political regimes in Africa, whereas in other places, elite facts were really important to initiate transition to democracy. In Africa, actually, one of the characteristics is that social movements were really important. Social movement protests were important for liberalizing the regimes. Then a third wave of protest unfolded from the 21st century, which was not only the context is different, but the dynamics of protest as well are different. Not only during this era we find different topics. Not only some of these topics are topics that have been inherited from the previous wave of protests, but we also have new questions and issues. And of course, there are other aspects that really maximize the impact of protests within African societies. So this book focuses essentially on this third wave of protest that has been unfolding since the 2000s, and that has had many different shapes and intensities. Not only across time, but also across countries. If we look at, for instance, that ACRED data, which has been collecting riots and protests in Africa, and not only in Africa, but across in many world regions, actually. So they have this system to collect geocoded protests in several world regions, including Africa. And we can see that, in fact, the third wave of protest is happening, and that it has been particularly intense from the first decade of the 2000s. 90% of the total of more than 80,000 protests that happened in Africa between 1997 and 2021 actually occurred within this period. And this has allowed many scholars to write really about this very spectacular third wave of protest in Africa, which we can really demark, not only because we can see it here, but because we see a very interesting production in the academic field in terms of trying to map and understand these various types of protests since the 2020s. Naturally, protests are not spread across countries equally. We have countries that contribute more for this effervescence, and South Africa and some of the countries that have experienced the Arab Spring are also countries that have high levels of protests. So making sense, since we know that protests have been important for remarkable milestones in African politics, such as independence, attaining democracy, and now in a different era of trying to, of mixing different types of claims, not only trying to save democracy in some cases, but in other cases trying really to force the liberalization of the regime, which was promised but never happened. So the question is that, well, if protests are that common in Africa, they are a conspicuous element of everyday politics in Africa, but are they transforming politics, in fact? For many, some are more skeptical and think that people are just in the streets, they are protesting, but that does not carry any effect. And with this book, what we started we also wanted to contribute to that part of the discussion, even though, of course, there are books out there that are, and work out there that is already doing that effort. What do we know about this third wave of protests so far? We know why people protest. They are based, of course, on material issues, such as bread and butter issues, but also on non-material issues, identity, liberties, choices, better policies. So not all issues relate to material issues. People don't go to the streets just because of the high cost of living. Of course, that matters, but it's not the sole reason. And sometimes we do have a combination of both. In terms of the agents of protest, we did find a large section of groups within society that are actually contributing for the rise of protests, from ordinary citizens to organized civil society to the youth. I mean, there's a lot of variance there. And in terms of the form of protest, we also find great variation and some forms of protest that are more significant in this third wave of protest, from mass demonstration, but also online forms of activism. Music and visual art have played an important role in many of them, but not only now, but have played an important role in many protests. But we also find innovative frames, mixing, sometimes native language with other messages in order to work in between the native and the more global, so to speak. Within this field, we didn't have much evidence about the transformative impacts of protests, and so this is why this was pretty much the driving idea behind the book. And to research this, what we decided to do with the book was to, ask the questions about it. So how transformative are protests? Do they really matter? If so, how? How can we explain varying protest outcomes? In terms of arguments, we argued first that change should be equated in different terms. So change could vary in degrees. It could be a lot of change or not enough change. But then we can have change that is tangible, that we can measure, such as a change in a policy. But then there's change that is difficult to measure, such as, if you participate in a protest and then you find that I have new ideas now. I have forged new solidarities. So we decided to work with the notion of change that is actually open-ended. So we said, well, we could have both limited or significant change in terms of tangible goals, such as regime change, blocking a president attempts to run in another election. But we might also have significant change that is intangible, difficult to measure. If you see that protest is increasing knowledge, is changing imagination, is creating emotional attachments and memories that can then in the future feed further protest. So in the book, we try to deal with this open-ended notion of change that might encompass different types and different dynamics of change. Also, we wanted this to be representative and emanating from the context rather than imposing a preset, theoretical framework. Also, in terms of the role of political opportunities. In the book, we deal with this dynamic approach to political opportunities. This means that even though we recognize that political opportunities are important, they are, of course, we are working with the concept, as many in social science, that is hard to measure, that encompasses a lot of things, from regime types of political opportunities to divisions within political elites, to the quality of democracy. So there are a lot of dimensions that can be understood as political opportunities. But we wanted to look at political opportunities again, not in a deterministic way, but to interact it with other factors that we knew could also, in combination with political opportunities, maximize the effect or the transformative impact of protest. So throughout the book, we have explored discursive opportunities, framing strategies, organizational resources, and we also take into account some aspects which are classical when we think about political opportunities, which are, agency and reflexivity, because even though opportunities might be there, but if citizens don't recognize it as such, that doesn't mean that they are not carrying out their activities as protesters, but it means that they are not making the rational calculation that this is a political opportunity. I take advantage of this and I try to exploit it. So we try to deal with this contingency, and also we consider that political opportunity structures vary depending on the type of movement, on the type of issue, and also in terms of the field itself. So this was the overall framing of the book. And once again, I want to thank all the authors that actually participated in this, because it was really a challenging period with the COVID, and some of the authors have had, kindergartens were not working. In some countries, there was serious political instability, strikes. Some people couldn't do the interviews. So honestly, there's a thank you in the book, but really, it was. I was really so happy to be able that this book finally was published. And then in the end, when Routledge selected it to be, open access without me asking it for it, but when they selected it, I was so happy, because I felt like, well, this is like a prize for everyone to be able to share this book widely for everyone. So thank you once again. About the contents, I'll be very brief. I'll jump to the conclusion. So these are the 13 actually chapters they make part of the book. So we have a chapter on Cabo Verde that includes that I co-authored, which is Elopes. Then we have a chapter on Ghana written by Andrea and Jan. Then a paper on Senegal by Mamadou Dime. A paper on Burkina Faso by Eloise Bertrand. Sami Badran on a paper on Morocco, and then Luca Bussotti and Laura on Mozambique, then Claudia, Ana Lucia, and Paulo on Angola, François Paulet on Congo, then Michael Mutiaba on Uganda, Alexandra and Yared on Ethiopia, and finally on Eswatini we have Maxwell Mtembu. So these were the chapters that were included in the paper. I didn't know half of the people that contributed to this book, which was really another opportunity to engage and to learn. And also we wanted to have, parity in terms of gender, but also guarantee that, we had 50-50 participation between people from, European universities and from African universities as well. So we wanted to promote that. We wanted to be as fair as possible in terms of the representativeness of the sample. We didn't, I didn't force any team, any approach. People were more or less free to choose their path in terms of the focus of which social movement they wanted to study. So there are a couple of biases in the book, but the bias mainly results from preferences. I hope they did not affect the picture that we present of popular movements, popular protests, but they are basically the choices of the authors, and I'm very happy with them. So to finish, so first of all, we find a constellation of social actors intervening in popular protests in Africa, different motivations, from changing policy design and implementation in Cabo Verde and Mozambique, to fight political corruption and bad governance in Ghana, to stopping presidents from pursuing a third mandate in Senegal, Burkina Faso, or DRC, to bringing in more democratic regimes and better policies in Angola, Eswatini, Ethiopia, and Uganda, or to advance the gender equality agenda in Morocco. We find mixed outcomes. In some countries, we do find that they were able to attain their goals. See, for example, the case of Burkina Faso or Senegal, where president indeed did not run for a third mandate in face of strong popular protests in the countries, of course, in combination with other factors, or Cabo Verde and Mozambique, where in fact protests were part of the driving force leading to stopping an important project of land grab in Mozambique, and in Cabo Verde, a law that would increase the salary of legislators and would give them other perks in Cabo Verde. So it was important, but in other places, particularly in authoritarian settings, results were not as satisfactory. But even in those settings, the fact is that many of the case studies reveal that they transformed their solidarity. They transposed the barriers of fear in many of the authoritarian countries. Second set of, let me see how I'm doing in terms of time.
That's the time.
You have to tell me. So I'll finish in 2 minutes.
You're the author. I don't want to.
No, but you should have. You should have. I'm not. I understand. So in terms of what do we find that institutional opportunities matter, such as election proximity, splits within the regime, and regime openness were mentioned in a couple of papers. In several countries, we do find that the legacies of prior democracy or anti-regime struggles were really important for, giving legitimacy in the present to protesters, and that in some countries they use historical symbols and leaders, Pan-African leaders, as a way to legitimize a protest. In terms of framing strategies in different countries, we do find that activists try to make issues more salient, try to link diverse issues, and they also try to sometimes go beyond the national frontiers, but trying to link with other people in efforts actually to maximize their results. I will go to the future so that we hear our colleagues. So for the future, what I thought was interesting in the book is that there is despite the more inhospitable environment in authoritarian settings, the fact is that protests are really more frequent in those types of regimes. So actually, what are the elements that enable the formation of free spaces in authoritarian regimes? In several case studies, we do find that protests actually sow the seeds for future uprisings. So this means that we need to be able to identify what are those seeds made of: emotional, cognitive frames, resources. How are they nurtured? How are people keeping these interactions live? And what is the tipping point that makes them flourish in a particular time? Then resources are important, and of course, both collective and individual resources. I've seen kinds of protests that live pretty much on the charisma of the leader of the protest, such as, for instance, Bobby Wine in Uganda. There is one absence in the book. We don't deal much with rural forms of protest in Africa, and I mentioned this. This is really important because it's not something that we intended. It's just resulted from the people that focused on selected the case studies. But we know that this could have an implication because not only in Africa there has been historically divisions across rural and urban areas, but this has led to the formation of cleavages, important cleavages, but also diverse forms of interaction between the state and civil societies in both areas, which means that the grievances are different, the forms of protest as well. So this is something that the book misses, a part of dealing more with the more international networks of social movements, even though there are some contributions on that front. But I think that overall these are the main lessons of the book. I'll now pass the floor to the next speakers, and I'm sorry that I took more than I was supposed to. Thank you.
Thank you, Edalina, so much for the. I'll follow the order that we have in the poster, and now we have Zachariah for about 10 minutes. Okay, Zachariah, it's up to you. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those in North America. Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me again. I really love this forum that you guys have put together. Congratulations to Edalina in particular for pulling together this wonderful volume. I found it to be a really interesting read, quite comprehensive in a number of cases and different themes that the volume was able to explore. And I love the fact that it was open access and included a wide variety of participants, including many from African institutions, which I think is a hugely important accomplishment. So congratulations there. I'll try to keep my comments short so that we can have a discussion here. And I just wanted to raise a few different things that I think this volume brought to my mind, particularly in regards to how we can move the conversation and the research agenda around African protest forward. Because I think, we are now in the second decade of this third wave of African protests. That in itself is not surprising. The earlier waves of protests that we documented in our 2015 book also stretched across multiple decades. And so again, here we are seeing that this wave is in its second decade, and as if we can learn from our previous experiences, we might expect that this current phase of the third wave of protests may be the most consequential yet. And I think there's a lot of at least anecdotal evidence that this is true. We're seeing some of these dynamics coming to a head in places like Senegal, where some of you may know if you've read the chapter from this book or been paying attention more generally. Macky Sall's administration has been playing games with the presidential election. This is something that Yanamar was pointing to as early as the first year of the Macky Sall administration. Ali Ulsan, the General Secretary of Myanmar, was actually just recently released from prison after several months in jail for his criticism of the Macky Sall regime. If we look to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I was earlier this year or earlier last year, we can see that the Lucha activists, a movement that began back in 2012, was also recently targeted. Several of their leaders were arrested by secret police in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so again, we're seeing, the sort of long-term effects of these movements and the ways that they've actually been able to consolidate their position within these societies in ways that I think might be consequential going forward. Now, what do we make of all this? I mean, in some ways, as the book makes clear, these protest movements have not been as successful as we may have liked. Certainly, there are notable cases of success, as Edalina pointed out in her opening remarks. But by and large, in many of these countries, more than a decade after some of these movements have emerged, the political situation remains far from anything like democracy. Ordinary people in particular are facing quite harsh conditions, not only due to the political situations in these countries, but also the economic conditions, which have become quite difficult. We are seeing a massive amount of out-migration from African countries in ways that I think are hugely consequential, especially considering that many young people in particular, often with educations, are choosing to leave altogether. Again, something that's not surprising, but I think is an important factor for us to take into consideration. But where does that leave us in terms of the study of African protests more generally? And here I want to just highlight a few themes with my remaining time that I would like to see more research on. And I think there is no better audience for me to make this plug. Some of these things I tried to explore in a recent article that I published on African Studies Review a couple months ago now, I think, which really focused in on the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, but was also trying to look at some of the broader dynamics that I think is an important part of it. So my first comment is really to try to push for more cross-national work on African protest. I understand the need and the desire to do case study work. I think there is huge advantages to case study research, but I also think that this group in particular should also be trying to make bigger statements about what's happening across the continent, to do comparative work and to try to understand how these cases are similar to each other, and also, importantly, in what ways they depart. I also think, related to this, that it's good to try to put Africa more into conversation with other regions of the world. As we know, with the current wave of African protest, Africa is not unique. We've seen similar spikes in protests around the world, particularly in the countries of the global South. And I think, intellectually, it is important on us to not exceptionalize Africa, right? To take an explicitly trans-regional approach where we look at Africa and see it as not only something that can be compared, but also as potentially a model for protest movements around the world in the global South, but increasingly, I think, in the global North as well. I'm a scholar based in the global North, and I'm always struck in many ways by how some of the dynamics that I study in the African context really help me understand politics in my own country of the United States. A few other things that I want to raise here. One is, the question of violence and protest. When we wrote the book Africa Uprising back in 2015, there seemed to be a clear trend of a decline in violence and an increase in unarmed social movements. I took this as a very positive trend, and I had posited that perhaps there was a relationship between the two, that young people had exhausted the possibilities of violent struggle and were increasingly turning to nonviolent protest as an alternative. And I think, now in the second decade of this third wave, perhaps the pendulum is swinging back. There is a lot more evidence coming out now showing that, violence has reemerged across the African landscape. We've seen this both in the terms of the number of armed groups that are starting to operate in different African countries, as well as, the reemergence of the military with military coups across West Africa in particular. And that, I think, forces us to ask the question of what is this relationship between violence and protest? If we were incorrect to suggest that they were substituting for each other, that nonviolence was increasing as violence was decreasing, then what exactly is happening now, where we seem to see both substantive amounts of nonviolent protest, but that is accompanied by increase in violence as well. What does this mean? What is the relationship between the two? How should we think about them? Another thing that I think would be really useful, and Edalina already hinted at this in her comments, is that we need a lot more research on rural protests. This was really the focus of my African Studies Review article, because like Edalina, our book was very much focused on urban forms of protest. There is a strong urbanization bias when it comes to African politics. We talk a lot about the growth of urban areas across Africa for very good reasons. But we should remember that more than 60% of the African population continues to dwell in rural areas, and that many of these rural spaces are rife with different kinds of protest activities that are actually super interesting and deserve a lot more attention. And so the article that I wrote was sort of a call for more attention to these areas, not to create a binary between urban and rural, but rather to show how they are interrelated. A lot of these dynamics are very clear cut. We know that almost all or many of the participants in urban protests are recent migrants from rural areas. We also know that many urban dwellers have returned to rural areas in the aftermath of COVID. We also know that there's increased movement within rural areas, so people moving from one rural area to another rural area. And I think all of these dynamics have been understudied thus far. Less so in, say, anthropology and history, but in the other social sciences, political science, my home discipline, for example, we tend to focus much more on the urban realm than we do on rural protests. And I think we should try, as at least one of these articles did, to see more about what's happening in rural spaces when it comes to the question of protest. The other thing that I think would be useful is more attention to some of the transnational dimensions of protest unfolding currently. I think one of the interesting dynamics that I've been paying attention to are efforts to try to build solidarities between African movements and movements outside of the African continent. Perhaps most visibly, we see this in terms of African support for the Palestinian cause. Obviously, that has generated a lot of support around the world, and African movements have voiced some support for this. I don't want to overstate the amount of support that is being offered here, but I've seen very clear linkages between, for example, the movements in Sudan and the movement for Palestinian liberation that I think are really interesting and harken back to earlier eras. I have seen similar dynamics here in the United States between Black movements in the US around police brutality and African movements. Some of these have become quite elaborate and have involved exchanges between activists across continents. And I think this is a really interesting dynamic. I'm almost out of time, so I want to just raise a couple more things here.
If you can be very brief, I would thank you. Sorry to...
Okay, so last point. The last thing I just want to say is
okay.
We should be paying a lot more attention to some of the economic forces that are unfolding and how they are continuing to shape African protest movements. I think, again, as a political scientist, we pay a lot of attention to political systems, and that is very understandable. But I think what has become clear, whether we're talking about inflation, whether we're talking about the rise of China in Africa, whether we're talking about the decline of the West across the African landscape, that these sort of larger economic forces and their sort of downstream impacts on Africa, whether it becomes a question about jobs, whether it becomes a question about broader economic opportunities on the continent, is something that we need a lot more research around. I think there are some very interesting projects right now looking at the question of inequality and what that looks like in the African context, and how that might be contributing to social movements and protest dynamics. But I think that's, again, another space that I would encourage all of us to think much more about as we go forward. And I'll leave it at that. And thank you so much for inviting me to join you today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sakurai. Sorry for cutting your... All right, so we'll move to Maria Angeles. Maria, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Edalina, for inviting me. Thank you to the fellow enthusiasts of African studies that we are here sharing this moment. Please forgive me if some French words coming because I just landed from Ivory Coast and really just ran to my parents' house to be able to participate in this book launch. No, thank you, Edalina, for inviting me. For inviting me because I really enjoyed the lecture of the book. And you know, I'm working on Sudan. I was working in the Sudan uprising a lot of time, and I was reading this compelling book of all these several case studies, and I was all the time thinking in analogies and difference with the Sudan case, and I was thinking about my students, how I can use the book, in doing the difference between the case study. So in the next few minutes that I have, I will just share some thoughts that I have of this work that I think is remarkable, and I think it is really a significant contribution to our understanding of the political dynamics in Africa. And I think it is very important. Of course, the book of Zachariah, African Rising, and this is not like the continuation, so we can continue and understand the interplay between the popular protest and the political opportunities and the transformative potential within the continent. The thing that I enjoyed the most, it is really the various case studies across Africa. For me, this is a very, very important contribution where you navigate through the complexity of the social movements, the resilience, the agency of the African communities and people who are engaged in the field. I think that for us, this is one of the main points of the book, the exploration of these different contexts in which the popular protests fall from the north to the south, the east to the west. And I was discussing this now when I was in Ivory Coast with friends from different communities. We were exploring the book together, and some different thoughts came to shape the landscape of the activism in Africa, and for sure for European students to put apart the notion of monolithic Africa and really emphasize the importance of context-specific analysis. I think this is a main point for us. So I think this is, for me, one of the main points, for our understanding of the diverse strategies that activists employ and the responses from governments and the grassroots movements in sub-Saharan Africa, and the narrative of African activism as a whole. So for me also, it is not, when I was reading the book, as when I work in Sudan, it is not only a scholarly activity for me. It is really a call to action. And I think this is very clear also in the book. We are not only academics, but we also know our reflections about the power dynamics can shape also the comprehension and the societies, and can compel us to appreciate really the agency of those who are challenging and daring to challenge the status quo. For me, this is not just a book. It is also a great way for understanding, for empathy, and this is the potential for positive change. I wanted to bring to the floor some reflections for the discussion. Maybe then when we open the floor, we can talk all together. How can we engage? How can, not only as academics, but with these African societies for a more democratic, for more accountable, for collective political landscape. This for me is very important, not only the theoretical work, but also the activist work. And the history of democratic struggle in some of the countries. You mentioned in your introduction, Edalina, this, of course, the fight of two forms of oppression, ethnic and regional discrimination, in more peripheral areas, and then the class oppression, more clear in the central regions. So maybe we can bring them together also. Of course, this is focused on non-violent civic mobilization, but for me it is really linked, so it could be interesting to bring them together. And also the different contexts, not only the national context, but also the regional, the international context. It is a moment of massive popular mobilizations, the continuation, as Zachariah mentioned before also, so maybe we can take them altogether in this historical background and understand the social unrest in the face of the intensification of the economic crisis, of the governance crisis, etc. And then I think, and this is, of course, this is because of my history with Sudan, but sometimes I see that it is very difficult to rebuild and modify the political scenario after a long period of an authoritarian government. And it's very difficult to assert the influence of an international community as well, because they have very different interests. So I think the case studies also reflect these difficulties and the division within the democratic forces also, and also the international involvement, which is really sometimes not helping civilian exercise to be a reality. Also, a challenge that for me is very important is how these popular protests and the uprisings can lead to effective political change in the medium and long term. I think this is something that all of us that work in social movements in Africa are interested in, this bottom-up approach. How can this be really a transformative potential of the popular protests and uprisings in driving effective political change? This is all along the book, but for me, this is one of the main points one of my main points of interest. The focus of our discourse is centered on this dynamics of bottom-up approach, but how can the change be achieved? And also the catalyzing role of education. I was talking about this now with my friends from Burkina, how the discussion on education emerged as a critical factor in sustaining the impact of these popular protests, and also the interplay with other institutions such as the military. Now, I'm thinking of course in West Africa now. So recognizing this potential of transformation, but it is not only the collective will of the citizens, the resilience, of course, the communities, but also the demanding change that has to go further. So how can we explore all these movements? How can they extend beyond the immediate demands and foster shifts in the political structures? This is for me one of the main points maybe we can discuss all together. And I wanted to thank you very much for your time, and I hope that we will continue now discussing.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
That's excellent timekeeping. Thank you, Maria. Now we'll have, I'll give the floor to Oscar.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, and it has been like a pleasure to read the book. It has been a pleasure now to hear my colleagues and people that I normally like read on a regular basis, and to keep on discussing very important aspects that have to do with this particular topic, which is an ongoing topic in which we have more questions, of course, than answers, as it is normal. I think, first of all, let me just bring some very quick intakes on the book. I think, to me, has been one of the most meaningful contributions that I've read to thinking about the characteristics and significance of the third wave. I think, as Maria Angeles was highlighting, I think the case studies bring very relevant aspects to understand some of the characteristics and nuances that we are trying to understand. I think it also interacts with most of the most meaningful literature, both on social movements globally and also in Africa. And I think this is an important aspect. Although I would like to also bring one question that has to do. For instance, to me was I was missing, for instance, the work by Manuel Castells, in this regard, which I think it's interesting also to keep in mind in this sense, and I will explain why. And I think that all in all is a very rich and diverse contribution that provide us with many interesting aspects that help us to inform and illustrate some of the most important aspects that have to do with African political protest in the last years. Let me bring three aspects that were to me particularly eloquent in understanding the issue. It's it's true that the book specifies and it's very explicit in saying which are like the main aims, but I think they're like meaningful aspects that help us to understand like this particular like topic. The first one has to do with this idea of going a little bit beyond our understanding of success or failure, which I think is a binary and like kind of problematic like point of understanding like political protest, to understand if something has failed or is successful, no? And I think to me it was especially interesting the use that you made from notions such as morphic fields or morphic like resonance, which I think help us to understand a little bit more this underlying impact of the political culture that protests somehow are shaping between generations. And I think this is an interesting thing, because I think it'll help us better to explain the continuities and connections that exist between these three different generations of protests that we are like assessing. Secondly, I think I like the way you used the idea of political opportunity as well, because I think you try to understand and focus on this idea by bringing the interaction with other like factors. And I think this is a very good way, especially from the international relations like field, in which from where I come, it's an important debate between agency and structure that help us to make things very complex and to understand like the complex interplay that all these different aspects have to do with this idea of political opportunity. And finally, I think it's interesting also the way you differentiate the political protest among different like types of regimes that are analyzed. And this is something that is also very explicit from the very beginning. And I think these again help us to avoid simplistic or binary assumptions that regime type conditions the process of political protest, because I think the chapters show us the ways in which new types of initiatives and dynamics of political culture can emerge even in authoritarian-like context. And I think this is an important contribution, as you were also, Edalina, like underscoring in your presentation. I think there are also three aspects that, just to bring a little bit like of controversy, I could not find in the book. Also, it's true that two of them are already recognized at the end of the book in the conclusions as future areas of research. So I think you acknowledge the fact that you would like to somehow continue with this like particular issue. Couple of them, in fact, have to or are matching some of the aspects that Zachariah was also like pointing out. First of all, I missed a much clearer connection between the African third wave of protest and the global wave of protest that the context of post-2011 also trigger like globally in two senses. I think it would have been interesting to assess the similarities and differences with them, especially for one thing that Zachariah was like highlighting, which is to challenge this framework that somehow exceptionalize African politics as something different. Because at the end, this is a current like trend that it's like shaping the political landscape in the whole world since 2011 in different like ways, with different like dynamics and with different patterns and evolutions in this regard. And also because I think it would have been interesting to engage with concepts that as I raised at the very beginning, that have been key to this assessment in the last like 10 years, which is, for instance, the concept of networked social movement raised by Manuel Castells, which I think is interesting. Although, as you probably know, in his book, he didn't even devote one single like line to talk about Africa, which is something unbelievable. Written in 2012, but at least to engage with the different aspects in which he builds up this idea of network like social movements, to see if network social movement as a notion somehow fits or not into the African like landscape. Secondly, I would have liked to the book to engage a little bit more meaningfully with the underlying meanings of the protests, in the sense that I think maybe the idea of democracy is a little bit given for granted, and in a context in which the colonial contributions are being, in African study, being very powerful and challenging somehow the grassroots of some of our notions, it would have been interesting to understand somehow these protests, which democracy are conceiving, negotiating, and creating in an intersubjective way. I think this is an aspect that is also needs some sort of reflection. And finally, I think it would have been interesting, as you said, and you acknowledge also at the end, that it would have been interesting a much deeper understanding of how regional solidarity and a new kind of some sort of Pan-Africanism might have been built through different experiences. Also, Zachariah was pointing out this, and I think, for instance, the experience or the example of affectivist from the social media field is especially relevant to bring, as an experience of kind of Pan-Africanism and solidarity among different countries and activists. Let me finish. I think I have 2 more minutes. Yes. Just 3 areas of research that I think could be added to those suggested at the end of the book. I think, to me, first of all, the role of women in most of these protests, because apart from the case of Morocco, probably maybe the feminist approach is not very clear in the whole book. And I think one of the things, at least in the protests that take place in the streets, in many contexts, the perception that men overshadow the role of women in shaping this protest. But we know that at the end it's not like this. I think this is a room, or this is a field for understanding what is the role of women in contributing to all of this protests. Secondly, has been also raised earlier, I think it would be, of course, interesting to understand how this the new wave of military coups interplay with the third wave of protests, because probably there are some elements that have to do strongly in terms of frustration, resentment, social unrest that have to do with the previous third wave of protest. Mm-hmm. And finally, and this is something that it should be also connected with what is taking place in many places, especially, for instance, in Europe or in the States, which is to understand the evolution of certain political cultures in order to assess whether, for instance, the wave of national populism, which in Europe or in the States, in other places, is being so important, somehow is also shaping a new type of protest in Africa. And I specifically want to raise the attention, for instance, to the protest that somehow backed military coups in Burkina and Mali, and somehow this resentment against the French presence. It would be interesting also to reflect on this specific issue. What do they mean? What type of connections have with previous mobilizations and political protests and so on? All in all, I've enjoyed so much this book. I also teach African politics here in Barcelona, and from now on, apart from other books that for sure, Zachariah's book, Africa Rising, this book will also be a very important contribution for my students from now on. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, I cannot thank you enough for your comments. I have written down all the comments, but I will not respond because we have to open the discussion to the floor.
So let's open at home and here, and let's collect a few questions or comments, either for Edalina or also for our other speakers.
Yes.
So who wants to start? I think we have one at home. Mm-hmm. Anyone here? Yeah. Huh? Oh yeah, then we'll start here and then we'll go at home.
Okay, so my question had to do with the situation in Congo, and I know that it's on your book. You talk about how the protests have been, that the third wave of protests is impacting Congo, if I'm not wrong, please correct me if I am. And if I'm not wrong too, this protest in Congo was demanding was trying to prevent the re-election of the actual president. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you could talk about this in the book, but the current situation about the overexploitation of cobalt mines, concerning the cobalt mines in Congo, that they're like actually having a slave trade there and human trafficking, and the government is actually perpetuating those corrupt ways of acting. I just wanted to know if the protests are having any impact in that order, just or if they haven't any political impact now, because I know that recently a man immolated himself just as a final act of protest to actually bring awareness to what is happening in Congo. And I would just like to know if it's having any change, because I'm a little bit behind.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we have Antonio José Paixão, if you want to go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, it's Paixão Antonio José.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Once again, thank you very much for this great opportunity. Thank you, Edalina, for great presentation. I was reading the book, actually, it's really very interesting because I'm working as well on African countries, although it's a different perspective. But somehow this book is being used by me as well for my research. So I have here 3 questions, and I'm gonna try to summarize as much as I can. The first one will be, what does political opportunity means in the outer view? And the second one should be taking into yes, what is exactly the meaning of political opportunity for the author of the book? That's what I would like to know. The second question, taking into account that most of the countries in African continent are very, very young, democratically talking, to what extent popular protests really represent political opportunity? And the last one is regarding as well about young regimes. If you go back to your presentation, there is a graphic, that represents the level of protests in the continent, and I could highlight top 9 countries with more protests. So the question is, besides South Africa and Kenya, how these countries today are doing, democratically talking, particularly the country affected by Spring Arab. Are they doing good? More or less, this is something that I would like to know as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions here or at home? I don't see any more here. Maybe Guya.
It's going to here.
Do you want to get closer?
Yes.
Well, sit with us.
Just because I'm not sure they can hear.
Very common question. I think it's a really an amazing project and concretized project, and I would love that you continue in this direction. Even if I know this is not your field, but it can be. I think you show that it can really be your field. And so what and also taking a little bit was some of the also intervents mentioned about the consequences. When you refer to, I didn't have the opportunity to read at this level of detail the book. So when you mentioned the point of the consequences, which we know that in social movement studies, the matter of the consequence and output is very difficult to address, as you mentioned, and those there are different levels, and there are what we call unintended consequences of social movements, and also like moving away from the understanding of consequence in terms of successful and failure, which I think is something very important too. And so you also mentioned this point of the role of social movements in creating new understanding, new views, which is absolutely important and fundamental, much more sometimes than creating or changing some policies, and also many times in creating new identities, new political identities. We saw this also in the Arab Spring. Is usually as a cycle of protest considered a failure one. But with consequences at a level of civil society, with dynamization of the civil society, the creation of new groups, etc. So I wanted to know a little bit more, if you can address this, which kind of consequences you see, if you have some examples to bring for this discussion in terms of this kind of sometimes unexpected consequences of this protest. Like to say. Thank you.
Well, I would have as well, if no one else has, very quickly. It seems to me that the book focuses very much on political events, on the political system, right? I was wondering about environmental movements, if you found anything on that. Yeah, that's a very simple question. Then, as Oscar was saying, it seems to me that the graph you've shown on the data protests over time, there is actually, there's an increase after 2010, but then after 2017, it pretty much seems to follow the same as in other places, where you also see an increase. Is that only an African tendency, or is also, it's related with more global trends? And I would be really curious then afterwards, we can have a look at that data, because I have some ideas if you want to follow and keep doing this path of how to, there's Guya was incentivizing you to do, to explore that data that exists on protests in Africa, but I'll tell you the idea afterwards, and that's it. Okay. And I don't know if our guests at home want to add anything as well, feel free. There's another question, and maybe we go for it.
Certeza. E depois we can maybe podemos traduzir para o público da sala.
Ok, obrigado. Eu lembrei-me agora de uma pergunta, agora que mencionou os gráficos, exato. Eu lembro-me que um dos gráficos aparecia que a África do Sul tinha a maior taxa de protestos e riots
motins.
E a minha pergunta, isto porque lembro de ver nas notícias que esses motins, milhares, etc., não tinham bem a ver com a questão política, se não me engano, tinham mais a ver com a questão racial, e se ou seja, e qual é, na verdade, a situação política, social, etc., na África do Sul, porque não investiguei sobre o assunto, honestamente, mas pelo que vi na altura está muito complicado, digo eu.
Oh, it's a lot of food for thought. Maybe we translate, but basically the question was, for those at home, was about the protests and riots in South Africa, and why is that?
The racial
and the racial divide there. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you all. I think I'm going to ask perhaps maybe Oscar, Zakaria, or Maria, do you want to perhaps pick up on some of the questions that were made, or just comment very quickly, and then just for the sake of time, I'll try to conclude, but I would like first for you guys to go on, perhaps if you want to, not obliged, but if you want to comment on a few questions, and then I can wrap up for conclusion. Yeah. Yes,
sure.
Perfect.
Yeah, no, I would be happy to. Yeah, really wonderful questions. I just have a couple of thoughts, not conclusive, but I think maybe again in the spirit of trying to think about how we move forward from here in terms of our studies. There was a question on the role of gender that Oscar put forward, as well as a question around sort of race in the South African context from one of the participants or from one of the audience members. And I think that sort of points to one of the dynamics that I think are really interesting here, which is the issue of identity politics and how that intersects with the current wave of protests. The issue of identity politics is obviously a hugely important one here in the United States. It is obviously a huge motivator of protest movements across the United States, whether we're talking about Black Lives Matter or the women's movements. Here, the question of identity is often at the center of that. It can play a huge force in terms of motivating politics, as we see with the abortion issue here in the United States. And I don't think we have enough information about how it plays out in the African context. I've heard from African activists that it can be a challenge for them. But we do see, for example, in the context of gender, the formalized world of African feminism is often quite detached from these sorts of movements that many of us study. It tends to be much more ensconced within, non-governmental organizations and foundations, and much more transnational than many of the movements that I at least have studied. This doesn't mean that there aren't many female participants in these movements. I would point to Lucha, for example, which has always had a large number of women leaders. Yanamar similarly has a lot of women who are involved, often behind the scenes, but who play a very important role. But I think the puzzle for me, and I think this is where the point I want to make, is the disconnect between this sort of formalized space of African feminism, which is this whole separate world, and these kind of popular movements that sort of coexist, often using the same kind of language, often raising the same kind of issues, but as far as I've seen, don't seem to intersect in any sort of meaningful ways. And I think that speaks to this disconnect between the identity politics-driven movements that we see in places like South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, elsewhere, and these sort of more bottom-up, grassroots, organic movements that many of us are interested in. And I say this as to try to stimulate more of an analysis on what are the actual intersections, because I just don't know, and I think it's a hugely important question. The other thing I wanted to just point out here, in response, I didn't quite hear the Congo question, but I think from what I took from the question, that's a hugely important subject to raise. Are these protest movements anti-capitalist? Right. Recently, there was a debate between Denis Mukwege, the Congolese Nobel laureate, and some scholars of Congo around whether we should understand what's happening in Congo as purely the product of these sort of machinations of global capitalism, and hence both the violence and nonviolent responses to it as anti-capitalist mobilizations. I, again, am not 100% convinced by that framing. I mentioned earlier that I live here in the United States. There's a lot of, I think, discussion within the Western left around how we should think about African movements. Should they be located within a larger left anti-capitalist tradition, or are they somehow distinct? One of my responses to them is, from what I've seen, many of these movements are not calling for the end of capitalism, but that doesn't mean that they're not concerned with economic issues. I think one of our big goals with Africa Uprising was to sort of show that there are many different forms of mobilizing around economic issues that may not fall within traditional Marxist categories. And so we don't see unions, for example, being at the forefront of many of these movements. We don't see calls for the dismantling of capitalism as being the primary consideration. So, it lends support to the idea that these aren't traditional Marxist mobilizations. At the same point, as I mentioned in my comments, and I'll end with this, many of them are deeply concerned with economic issues, whether economic concerns around the cost of basic goods, whether concerns around rising inequality levels across African countries. Clearly, economics is playing a hugely motivating force for many of these movements, even if they haven't been articulated in sort of traditional Marxist frames. And I think, again, that's something that we need to be very attentive to, because it might just be that Africa is, again, sort of pioneering new ways for us to think about the intersections between economics and politics that go beyond some of the more traditional Marxist frameworks that many of us in the West tend to cling to, even if they may not help explain what's unfolding in many African countries, and indeed outside of Africa as well.
Thank you, Zakaria. So I don't know if Maria and Oscar, would you like to perhaps make some comments?
Yeah. Thank you, Galaya. Yes, I think the intersectional analysis is really necessary, but it is also difficult to accomplish in every case study. Also, well, my experience with some activism sometimes they don't want to talk about certain issues, or they don't think they are as important as we think they are. So sometimes during my interviews, I was blocked because the interpretation of some of the issues that we consider like essential are not like this, or even are disregarded or not like in the center of the debate, of the discussion. But I think, of course, well, what I saw is more the emphasis on this inequality, in the center-periphery inequality. The economic crisis is always there, political instability, and then this intertwines with all the other intersectional aspects. But sometimes for them are something like negligible. It's like, okay, we are social movements, we are doing this massive mobilization, so don't put like more pressure, no, because of some of the categories of analysis. And they put the emphasis in this, no, the hope for the political change, even in very close political spaces, or in scenarios that are very complicated when the transition is really difficult. There is a division in the movement, women and men, and the involvement, and a lot of divisions that make really the analysis that you have to cut into pieces and not only analyze the civilian leadership, but other analysis. So for me, I put everything in the category of power and the political process, but I think the questions are very relevant and give us also an idea of the limitations that we face when studying, no? When we deeply study a case study, and even in armed conflict, I mean, in these scenarios, no, when there is the mobilization, but it's really cut with these other dimensions. And I agree with Zachariah in everything he said. But yeah, I think the economic situation is always one of the triggers, and it is very disfavorable. It has devastating effects for the population. Same with the exploitation of the human resources and women, etc. That's what I can say.
Yeah, thank you. Just like a couple of maybe quick insights. One has to do with one thing that has been already like discussed, and in this attempt of not exceptionalizing African political protest, I think one of the aspects that at least in Europe is like quite meaningful is the fact that there is a huge divide between two types of protesters, or two types of like demands. One which is much more aligned with national populism, and the other one which is more like a transformative, like kind of left, which is much more concerned with the climate crisis, with the regression of democracy. I think it would be interesting to really understand, like, if certain like political contexts are also dividing this type of protest, not just in one like particular direction to be much more like transformative or whatsoever, but if they are like aligned with a kind of reactionary like framework, much more like fitted into the national like populism, populist way of understanding like politics. I think that would be interesting aspect. And the other thing has to do with the fact that at the end, one of the things that we are also like witnessing globally has to do with the level of uncertainty and volatility. And I think this is an aspect that also bring to the African like reality and a structural element, which is very important to understand, which is we can like understand some of the most important characteristics and trends, but at the end there is also a structure which is like bringing a great level of volatility, no? That will probably like lead and bring like this political protest into uncertain like directions. That's why it's so difficult to fall in this, to me, this trap of success and failure, like binary and divide, no? Because at the end, I think it's much more relevant to understand the meaning of what it's happening in the continent and worldwide in this sense.
Thank you. I don't know if the authors are online. I don't know, Ana Lucia, if you would like also to say a few words. If not, I'll just then wrap up. She's not.
Well, I'm here. Thank you, but I have cartoon background noise, and I'm not sure if it will work. No, I just want to thank you for assembling this quite nice gathering. I'm sorry I'm not physically at ICS as I intended to. And I would just like to say something on political opportunity structures, especially because in our text on Angola, we developed pretty much that framework, and we use that framework to explain the intangible consequences of protest, of an increasing protest and protest increase in Angola also due to a political change in the head of state. And that created a window of opportunity, and with other factors, there was a combination of different factors that allowed activists to be more vocal and be more present in the streets. And this is not only linked to one specific issue as the transition in the leadership of the state, in the head of state, but also it has to do with opposition political parties and their movements. It has to do with economic circumstances. It has to do with social and economic grievances. And all this combined created a structure and opportunity for protest. And thank you for giving the floor.
Thank you, Ana Lucia.
Thank you for being here, Ana Lucia. Nice to see you.
Well, let me just to conclude in 5 minutes. Tell me if I overlap.
This is your home.
Yeah.
But but let me know, because I'm that's fine with me.
You have a lot of questions. And...
Yeah. So let me just pick up on a few comments. So the first thing I would like to say is that, well, I'm not a specialist on social movement theory, but the amount of suggestions that you have presented a research agenda for future years. I think we should definitely write, a paper on this. I mean, of course, Zakaria already wrote a paper for African studies, but definitely I feel like there are so many interesting avenues for those thinking about writing on social movement and protest in Africa. I mean, definitely the growing linkage between violence and protest, the rural protest, which we didn't, apart from the chapter on Mozambique, which we didn't focus on. Actually, South Africa was one of the case studies I was poaching to have a second paper on rural protests in South Africa, but unfortunately we had a last-minute withdrawal and we couldn't include that paper in the book. But it was also difficult to find scholars, at least within my network, to compensate. So we have Mozambique, but I wish we had more to cover for that issue. And then you also mentioned the role of feminism and the role of women, and it's so spectacular because Sami Sadrani is not here, but the chapter on Morocco actually tells a very interesting story that can also advance this research field on a particular area. So it shows that within the F20 movement in Morocco, which was perhaps the most important movement during the Arab Spring in Morocco, that movement, they decided for framing strategies that were more convenient socially. So they silenced gender issues or issues that could be more problematic in order to have wider resonance. So that movement in particular, so that case study in particular actually shows how gender issues were somehow silenced within this F20 movement, so that the movement could have wider visibility. And by showing that, it's also revealing how within social movements or how within protest movements, there are competing agendas and how those agendas are pushed forward and why certain agendas might be silenced. So there is internal negotiation within social movements, and sometimes when we deal with social movements, we take them already as unitary actors in the field, like protesting, like they are a unitary front. Of course, they try to do that, but internally they are not negotiating which are the most important frames. And within that movement, it was clear that pushing on gender issues could clearly be dividing, and that the movement could lose some external support. So this is one of the papers that actually allow us to look at both gender issues on the one hand, but also the internal fragmented dynamics of social movements, and perhaps why some movements perish earlier than they should, or their divisions, and some movements break away and decide to do other things. But that chapter also shows how social movements, how that experience, our women experience within F20 actually helped them create, solidarities, and then allow them to continue to work on human issues outside the F20. So I know there's a big disconnect, as Zakaria was saying, between, the African feminist literature, and then what we do, of course, even when there's overlapping agendas, but sometimes we don't connect much. I also agree that we should collaborate more, conduct cross-regional studies. But when I was looking when I was searching for books on political opportunities and social movement, I could see that African case studies were missing in most. And as you were saying, Oscar, when we looked at Manuel Castell's book, and no single African, and then we started to create, to also, populate the field with African case studies. The goal is then to move forward to the second stage. After we populate the field, then we are also able to find commonalities, because without even having that first step, it becomes even difficult to say, well, the case of Cabo Verde actually resembles what happened in Portugal. So we need this first stage, even though it's not necessary. But if we also populate the field with more case studies, then we are better able to find similarities and contrasts. So even though I'm really an apologist of not essentializing Africa, so this is why I wanted to write a paper on on political opportunities. And some people said, well, this is working for Western European countries. What political opportunities here? Why are you bringing that concept? Maybe it doesn't make sense. You are stretching the concept. And to answer Paixão's question, actually, yes, for Africa, we departure from traditional classical definitions of what popular political opportunity structures are, but we try to flexibilize it, because not only this was necessary for Africa, but it's ongoing for other case studies. So it was not something that I craft just to fit the case study. It's something that widely social movement theorists are really discussing the limits of this approach. It can include both from regime characteristics, from having allies within the regime, from elite divisions, from proximity to elections that create an opportunity, that a turnover, a change in power, like in Angola, a president that has left and another that comes. So it can cover so many different dimensions that then it almost combines with context. It almost seems like, okay, this is the context. Why is it political opportunities? Because it's different, because people need to acknowledge it as political opportunities. So we try to deal actually with a more flexible framework for analysis, not because it's Africa, but because that discussion is already ongoing within social movement theories. I completely agree that we should move away from those binaries, success, failure. I tried to do that in the argument of the book, so that it is clear that we want to capture what is meaningful and what is there, instead of having a verdict on success and failure. And then to finalize, what I think it's very, even though we don't engage with a lot of things that such as international solidarities and connections, networks, social movements. You are totally right, Oscar. It was not possible, but it was not intentional. It was not an intentional neglect. It was just what arose. So we started this process without having. We had the questions, but not many deterministic assumptions. So we tried to deal with what we had. So we neglected some aspects, mainly because our eyes sometimes are biased. We go in the direction of certain topics and case studies. So with that in mind, what I would like to say is, first of all, thank you again. To conclude, thank you again for the comments and for the feedback. Again, I mean, there are issues that we didn't cover, such as, for instance, also as Tiago was asking on environmental social movements. I tried to invite people for that topic where we couldn't cover it. The one that got closer to it was the one on Mozambique, on rural projects in Mozambique. But other than that, the other papers cover other types of issues. These are issues that are growingly emerging. We could try and map these issues better, but unfortunately we don't have it in a paper, but it's happening. Guya, you also talked about, unintended consequences. Most of our papers discuss consequences, more or less, in terms of the changes that they provoke, in terms of if they provoke, changes in terms of tangible or intangible changes. But they also show something that you might not think will happen, is that that the experience that even in this particular case study on Morocco, when they say, well, female participants of this movement were really silent and their frames were really silent. But then this experience that was negative actually led them to create new forms of group action. So it's something that could otherwise be perceived as completely negative, but then actually it was something that led to more forms of activism. And there's a couple of other examples there, but it's 4 o'clock. But yeah, but thank you. I mean, we could
look for that. This is my task.
All right. Thank you so much, Edalina.
You should. There is a page of the seminar.
There's a page, so maybe I can show. Well, to finish, how do I share? Just to here, right? There. So, but before, so just to finish, next week in the seminar as well, and another collaboration that we have with ourselves as well, with the Council of European Studies and the Social Movement Network there. We are organizing a pre-event that we are doing to launch a pre-event that we have in the network before the main conference, which this year the topic broadly is Contemporary Challenge to Social Movement Studies, and we will have Lorenzo Zamponi, Simin Fadi, and Elena Pavan, bringing what they think are the main challenges, and Guya will chair the session and moderate. And in April, we will have
another colleague
from ICS, Luisa Rossini, talking about reclaiming the public spaces in Berlin. So that is our next session. We hope to see many of you there, especially next week, but in the other one as well. But I wanted to thank Edalina for this collaboration, and I hope that we can keep doing events together, and Guya as well.
Thank you very much, Edalina. I think it was a really great discussion. I hope that we will have more opportunities. And thank you also for everybody at home, and thank you to the people here. And see you next time.
I mean, thank you so much. You guys were fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Very nice to have you here.
Okay. It was really good.
Ok. Olha, foi meio... Desculpem aqui no início, mas a mim falta...
Bye, Edalina.
Bye.
No.
Adeus.
Did we stop recording?
Yes, let me stop if I think... desculpa, agora tu foi? Eu paro. Espera aí, aqui. Pronto.
Okay.
Guardar...
Na nuvem.
Guarda na nuvem?